Welcome to our new show, What Anyone Can Do podcast with Leo Batari and me, Randy Cantrell. Our new show picks up where our last show, Year of the Peer, left off, highlighting the simple truth that who you surround yourself with matters, and that if we enlist the support of others, give back to those who give to us, and pay it forward for the next generation, we can do anything. Author and keynote speaker Leo Batari and I will interview a diverse group of thought leaders who will share stories and insights that will help you succeed in business and in life. How? By doing the things anyone can do, but most of us never will. John Danner is a trusted advisor, teacher, author, and speaker. John has spent decades helping leaders and their organizations navigate rapidly changing environments to their advantage. He is the co-author with Chris Keeney of Built for Growth, How Builder Personality Shapes Your Business, Your Team, and Your Ability to Win. Discover your entrepreneurial builder personality with a free online assessment by visiting builtforgrowth.com. John also authored The Other F Word, How Successful Leaders, Teams, and Entrepreneurs Put Failure to Work with Mark Coopersmith. John anchors executive education programs on 5 continents, and he teaches tomorrow's leaders at UC Berkeley and Princeton. Find out more about John by going to his website, johndanner.com. We welcome John to the show.
John Danner, welcome to the show. So wonderful to have you here today. I know, of course, in Randy's introduction, talked about your incredible best-selling books, but I think both of these books, in their own way, are just really great fodder for this conversation around who you surround yourself with matters and what that looks like. I guess what I'd like to do first is talk about Built for Growth and how the builder personality shapes your business, your team, and your ability to win. Because I know there was a great focus from your standpoint on looking at the personality of the founder and then trying to build a team around that and see what that looks like. And it was, I think, central to the different founder personalities, which we can talk about. I love taking your quiz, by the way, which we'll get into in a little bit as well. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about that work and you and your co-author, Chris Kuhn, I believe, right?
Chris Keeney.
Keith Keeney. Okay, thank you. All right. Well, there we go. So tell us a little bit about that work and what that looked like for you.
Well, Chris and I are colleagues at Princeton. We teach entrepreneurship courses there and have for a number of years. We became very fascinated with this issue of how do you connect growth, which is the fundamental imperative of any business, to what we've always seen as really the central mystery of the entrepreneurial process, whether you're talking about standalone startups, or you're talking about growing a company from inside an existing corporation. And that mystery isn't about so much what's involved in entrepreneurship or how to do this particular step or that particular step, but the central question of who. Who are these people that create highly successful, scalable ventures? So having shared that fascination, we were able to use a methodology that Chris had developed in his former business and patented, which is an extraordinarily powerful way of dissecting personality characteristics. It borrows from the early tradition of Myers-Briggs that many of your viewers and listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with, but focuses that very specifically in the context of the entrepreneurial process itself. We interviewed hundreds and hundreds in building the algorithm database. And then the power of this methodology is that it enabled us to take from all of those billions of permutations and combinations of answers to our original 100-plus questionnaire. We were able to boil that down to the 10-question builder profile quiz that your viewers and readers can take by just going to our website, www.builtforgrowth.com. And in a few minutes, they can get the benefit of seeing how their answers to these 10 questions might help them understand which of these personality types we identified that they may be most alike. We interviewed, as I said, hundreds of folks, and out of that work identified these four very different builder personality profiles: the driver, the explorer, the crusader, and the captain. And I'm happy to exemplify and give. That's the mental framework that we discovered. And the nice thing about it is that, a lot of people are fascinated by entrepreneurship, and many people have ideas to start a business or grow something on their own. But they sometimes think, because of the way the media portrays successful entrepreneurs, that they have to be like the next Steve Jobs or the next Elon Musk in order to do that successfully. And what our book and research has found is that, in fact, there are at least four very different doors to enter that world of entrepreneurship. And people can come into it with their own particular personal style, with its strengths and weaknesses, but leverage who they are uniquely as a way of building their own particular approach to growing a successful business.
So great. So how does, I would assume that knowing ourselves better is going to give us great insights into the kind of people we surround ourselves with. So what might that look like between the builder and the explorer, for example? I mean,
well, let me give you an example, and I'll start with a very basic definition of entrepreneurship, which I tend to use in most of my work. I borrow it from a professor at Harvard Business School called Howard Stevenson. He defined entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunity beyond the resources you control. And the nice thing about that and the work that we've done is that of all the resources that an entrepreneur does not control, money, time, facilities, intellectual property, technology, whatever it may be, there is one resource which is at least potentially absolutely in the control of the entrepreneur, and that's their personality, who they are. And to the extent they can understand that more clearly, they have an ability to leverage it to maximum advantage in pursuing their entrepreneurial mission. So let me flesh out these four, and then we can talk about how to potentially put them together in different kinds of configurations. The driver is probably the iconic person that many people have in mind. Drivers knew almost from the get-go that they were almost compelled to be an entrepreneur. They're fascinated, fixated really, by products and solutions, and they have such a high degree of self-confidence in their understanding of what markets are looking for that they can be not only tenacious about pursuing it, but they can be a little rough around the edges in working with. Steve Jobs would be a great example of that on the famous side of things, although there are many, many, many millions of people who share those same driver-like characteristics: product fixation, single-mindedness, almost what Chris and I like to call product narcissism. They tend to confuse who they are with what they're offering in the marketplace. And although I know our topic is not politics, I think it's fair to say that our current president shares some of those driver-like characteristics from his entrepreneurial background. Secondly are folks that we call explorers. And these are people who, unlike the driver who's focused on product, explorers are fascinated by the puzzle. They like taking problems apart. They are very much systems thinkers, and they tend to be almost entrepreneurs to some extent by accident. They're drawn into a particularly elegant solution to a problem that they've been interested in or intrigued by, and realize that being an entrepreneur may be a way to commercialize and share and scale this ingenious solution that they've come up with. Jeff Bezos would be a famous example, we think, of an explorer. They manage differently, they lead differently, they make decisions differently, and they approach colleagues in a very different way from the point of view of managing. The third type would be what we call crusaders. If you've ever eaten Ben & Jerry's ice cream, you've tasted the product of probably two examples of crusaders. People that are motivated not by product per se and not by puzzle, but really by mission. These folks have a very long-term view of what they're trying to accomplish. They tend to be very, very concerned about the culture that they create, about the social impact that their businesses leave behind, and manage and lead and also make decisions very much differently than those other two I talked about. And then finally, captains. And Leo, you said that when you took our quiz, captain was your label.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, captains again, not product, not puzzle, and not mission necessarily, but they are intrigued by the possibility that a team can create. They tend to manage less around the me and more around the we. They're great at facilitating, empowering, enabling, and they also are fairly pragmatic people by and large. They're able to change strategies, they're able to change products and missions in the marketplace, but they do so in a much more collaborative way. Okay, so with that background, let me give you some idea about how you might put some of these things together. Chris and I developed a concept that we called polar complements. Drivers, as my description would have suggested, are pretty difficult to collaborate with sometimes. They're so single-minded, they're so confident in their own answers that it's often tough for them to share the wheel, if you will, to share the steering wheel. However, if they can put themselves together with folks who have some of the characteristics of the crusader, who are so good at giving people a sense of meaning and mission and purpose to what they're doing, that combination can work fairly effectively. The flip sides of each personality are really the strengths of the other. So what do crusaders lack sometimes? what we like to say in the book is that crusaders sometimes confuse vision with the absence of supervision. They tend to hire people who share the vision and may or may not be the right skill set to get the job done on a day-to-day basis. That's a problem that most drivers don't have. Drivers want you to do what they want you to do, and they'll look over your shoulder, they'll second guess you, they'll be difficult to delegate, and that can work for a while, but in some cultures you want to give people a sense that I'm there for something other than the actual work I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, and that's where crusaders can be so helpful. And then, in parallel, the combination of a captain who is great at empowering teams matches nicely with the explorer who, left to his or her own devices, can sometimes have a kind of mechanistic view of the people around them. They're variables in an equation, they're pieces in a puzzle. And oftentimes, explorers struggle with the more human side of managing and therefore don't get as much benefit sometimes out of the real capability of the teams, which is the secret of the captain. Captains, on the other hand, because they tend to surround themselves with these teams, can insulate their own insight from what's going on in the marketplace. And that's where an explorer and to some extent a driver can be so useful, because they always have their ear tuned to new trends in the market and what customers are looking for.
So Randy, after hearing the explanation of those four personalities, if you had to guess, and it'll be fun because I know that you're going to take it right after we're done today, which would you guess when you consider your work as a leader, as an entrepreneur? Where would you fit in, you think?
Probably a crusader. I feel like I am probably a crusader. And I will admit, I'm pretty sure, John, that I took it some time ago, and before we hit record, I was looking for it, and shame on me, I couldn't remember. But that would be my speculation that I am. John, what are the difficulties? A big question, I suppose, but the difficulties of a leader recognizing, they recognize their own value, of course, but to see that value in someone else who is a polar complement, as you say.
Well, part of it is a matter of open discussion. We talk in the book about co-founders, because a lot of entrepreneurs want to start businesses with somebody else, even though they may not know anything about their particular working style or how it fits into our framework or not. And oftentimes, in our experience, people start with an assumption that that's a negotiation. We suggest, wait a second, it's really a conversation to begin with. It's a matter of sitting down and talking about each other's views on these four fundamental factors. How do I make decisions? How do I lead? How do I manage? My overall motivation to be an entrepreneur or to get into this in the beginning.
John, we
and
cut
those
out.
Four questions.
We cut out for a second.
sorry.
We missed the fourth one.
Okay, motivation.
Okay.
How am I motivated? If you start a conversation around those four fundamental questions, and you listen carefully to what you're hearing and what you're saying about your own answers, it gives you the beginning of seeing how you might develop a working relationship that recognizes the obvious, which is that none of us are perfect. We all have flaws. We all have weaknesses. The real issue is, can we complement one another's weaknesses at the same time that we're reinforcing one another's strengths? And if we can put those things together in a more conscious way, we have an ability to get done far more together than we could ever get done separately. And at the same time, to create a framework and a culture, because culture is created with the very first hire. Culture is created in small teams. Culture is created in one-on-one relationships. If we can do that with a more conscious set of introspection and candor, we have an ability to set a framework for resolving disputes and disagreements and really tapping into the benefit of diversity, which is ultimately one of the other great resources that any leader or executive or entrepreneur has access to.
So it's safe to say then, I guess, understanding ourselves can be really key, obviously, to making sure that we surround ourselves with the right people to be successful, correct?
Chris and I have the audacity. You know the phrase from Socrates, know thyself. Chris and I had the audacity to make a slight amendment to that, which we say, apply thyself. In other words, yes, know yourself, but then do something with that knowledge.
Yes. Yeah, it's good stuff. Hey, one of the things, of course, you mentioned is that we all have flaws. We all have, weaknesses, which means sometimes we make mistakes. And, in your book, The Other F Word, also, as Randy mentioned, Amazon bestseller, you look at failure and you look at the failure value cycle and what that looks like in organizations. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. And then maybe, if possible, be able to link it to, I'm wondering which type of entrepreneur is more failure tolerant than the other necessarily. But if you could talk a little bit about that whole failure value cycle and learning, I think that would be
Sure. Well, you can't be an entrepreneur without having a relationship with failure, whether it's one you seek or not. It is going to be part of the process. So the sooner you come to terms with your own attitude about it, and more importantly, your ability to use it, the better off you're going to be. Failure is a fact and force of nature. We're human beings. We're fallible. We're going to make mistakes. My co-author on that book, The Other F Word, is a Berkeley colleague of mine, Mark Coopersmith. And Mark's the one that really came up with what I think is the great analogy here, and that is that failure is a little bit like gravity. It is a force and fact of nature. It's something we cannot ignore. We might try to deny it or even try to defy it, but it's there. We've got to deal with it. And whereas failure is always a regrettable event. I mean, nobody goes out and says, we want to be number one in failure. We fail better than anybody else around. We think that there's an opportunity, and the reason we wrote the book is to turn failure from a regrettable event into a strategic resource. And I use that term advisedly. Failure is unique. It is really reality's way of showing you that you've been conducting an experiment all along. However confident you were in your assumptions, however aggressive you were in execution, something didn't work out the way you wanted it to or the way you expected it to. Reality's got that lesson waiting for you if you are honest enough and maybe humble enough, and sometimes humorous enough to acknowledge it and really look into it. So we created this 7-stage failure value cycle to help people try to both understand where they personally and where their organizations are in terms of taking a more productive relationship towards this fact of nature called failure, or the other F word as we've nicknamed it. It starts with respect. And oh, by the way, we borrowed a page from Pirates in calling each of these stages with the letter R. So it starts with respect. And the reason for that is that if an organization or an individual doesn't respect the pervasiveness and likelihood of failure to begin with, they will often blind themselves to failures in the making. They will create a culture in which failure is a taboo. And in doing so, they will make it, ironically, much more expensive, much more difficult, and potentially more threatening to deal with and resolve the very issues that are going to create failure in their organization or in their strategy. So it starts with respect. Second, rehearse. You know, it's interesting. Every organization has fire drills or earthquake drills, or unfortunately now terrorism drills or shooter drills or whatever. But failures, business failures, mergers and acquisition failures, team failures, product failures, advertising failures, executive failures, those are much, much, much more common. And yet most organizations don't rehearse for those more common and expected kinds of failures. So they get caught having to improvise in situations that were very foreseeable and which could be dealt with on a much lower level with much fewer consequences had they taken the time to anticipate them and rehearse for them. Then there's the issue of how do you, in effect, recognize failures earlier? What's your early warning system? If you're a fan of the Spider-Man movies, you know, probably the best way to get a failure-savvy organization is to think, does your organization have the equivalent of Spidey sense? Or if you're a Star Wars fan, something who could detect a disturbance in the force, right? Something that may be happening in the perimeter of your organization that would give you the early symptoms, the early signs that there's a failure in the making. And by getting that early warning, give you a bigger portfolio of responses that you could take to it and minimize the consequences of it. So respect, rehearse, recognize, and then obviously failure happens. So what do you do? How do you react? What is your culture for dealing with failure in the moment? How do you make decisions? How do you deal with outside press, media, customers, suppliers? And you can see in various kinds of organizations just the tremendous difference with which people respond in the moment to those kinds of failure situations. Do you blame people as opposed to take some sense of personal responsibility, perhaps even to the point of a public apology? Do you send people cowering in the woodwork to not ever deal with this? Or do you deal with it in a more straightforward and honest and transparent way? Then it comes time to basically reflect on it. And by reflection, we mean something more than finger pointing. We mean something more than just walking away from it quickly, because it has the advantage of giving you insight that nothing else you've ever done can give you. You tried something, you invested something in it, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? What was it that was going on there? How do you go through failure in a much more reflective and deep analytical way than the way many organizations tend to deal with it? Then you get to rebound. Rebound is getting back in the game, but getting back in the game, not playing the same strategy. It's how do you incorporate those lessons that you've learned in a way that allows you to improve your opportunity for success, coming back into the same context or with the same customer or the same situation that prevented the failure to begin with. And finally, and this is one that really surprised us. We hadn't thought about this one when they did the book, but several of our interviews suggested, you know, most people want to forget failure. They want to walk away from it. But you need, as the last stage in this failure value cycle, remember. Remember. How does an organization remember its own failures? And I don't mean that as a way of hand-wringing, but how did they go through it? How can they use it to build a more positive, failure-savvy culture? And we have several examples in the book of people that have done exactly that. I'll give you one example that we kind of like. Have you ever heard of WD-39? Probably not, right?
Right.
But the Rocket Chemical Company went through WD-1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 39 before they got to WD-40, which has become a worldwide standard product for years. When you went into the headquarters of a company like Rocket Chemical, you saw on their corporate trophy case those early canisters, WD-1, 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera. Or why is it called Chanel No. 5? Well, because there were 4 predecessors that didn't smell as nice as Chanel No. 5.
One of the things that I'm not sure organizations are always particularly good at, I'd love you to address this, is sometimes someone will embark on a strategy and it fails. But the problem is they don't know whether it was a bad strategy or it was a poor execution of that strategy, which can really be, dangerous. If you walk away from a perfectly great approach just because it was poorly executed instead of, so what are some of your thoughts on how we can identify that more effectively?
I'll give you 2 suggestions. The first is the sequence of questions that you ask. When I work with companies and organizations around the world, or when I'm in front of classes of executives or students, I often say, well, so what's the first question that comes to mind when a failure happens in your job or in your organization? And far too often, the first question out of people's mouths is who? Who's responsible? Who needs to be fired? Who needs to be disciplined, et cetera? And if that's the first question that you or your organization is asking, you are much less likely to get the real answers that matter. And those answers are the answers of where did this happen? What happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen? That's where the real insight can come from. Who is, yes, it's nice to know, but if you're really looking at trying to dissect a failure, be prepared to have that answer to that last question, who, come right back to you. Because oftentimes people tend to think that there is a sense of lack of responsibility for a situation. People like to look elsewhere for the solution. But when you really probe many failures more deeply, oftentimes you've been a part of it yourself. It has your fingerprints on it to some extent. An omission, a decision, something that you helped create. So that's why I use the term humility as part of this reflective process. So that's one suggestion. The other is when you're trying to think about using failure as a tool, as a resource. By the way, this sounds like heresy because I teach at the business school at UC Berkeley, but the message is fundamentally don't think always like an MBA. I'll give you some analogies. Think like a detective. Something's happened here. Nobody knows what's happened. Figure it out. They're clues. They're pieces of puzzles that need to be created. Figure it out. But don't worry so much about who is involved. Second, you might think about it the way a gardener thinks about a compost heap, right? Nobody wants to eat their compost. Compost don't smell all that nice. They don't necessarily look all that nice. But a great gardener knows that somewhere in that compost pile is something that's going to make their next garden that much better. And to some extent, failures like that. Or think like an artist. Artists are great at using what they call negative space to give us insight that we couldn't otherwise perceive. Failure is like negative space in many organizations. If you look at it, if you go into it and evaluate it, you will find insight that you otherwise would be missing. And lastly, and by the way, I'd love to be able to take credit for this one, but I can't. It came from one of my students at the business school at Berkeley a number of years ago. She came back into our class on failure, and she said, it's interesting to me. Business people tend not to use the language of science when they talk about strategies or initiatives or hires or whatever. But scientists use the vocabulary of experiments. And ask yourself, when you hear the term experiment, Do you expect every experiment to succeed? Chances are not. But everything we do in business, from the person we hire, the team we organize, the strategy we develop, the product we design, the merger we go after, they're all experiments. Think about them as experiments. Yes, some are going to work, great. Some are going to succeed, fantastic. But many are not. And in those many that are not are the insights and lessons that can help us succeed going forward.
Yeah, if you remember, Randy, last year, Vitaly Galam, who basically heads up new ventures for HP, talked a lot about one of the big challenges of the entrepreneurs. They have an idea in search of a business model. And for them, there's a lot of trial and error. And by definition, a lot of failure when it comes to just figuring that whole thing out. And but I do want to get back to, so among the 4 personalities we talked about, I mean, I have some guesses around this, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but is there a personality that is typically a little more tolerant or understanding of how to learn from failure or accept the reality of failure, like gravity, as you talked about, than any of the others?
I think the short answer to that one is no. Each of them have to deal with it, and each of them deal with it in very different ways. Let me give you an example or two. Drivers of the 4 are probably the most failure phobic in some senses.
Yep.
But that doesn't mean that they don't know how to deal with it and can't learn from it, because that tenacity that I talked about earlier means that they're paying very close attention to what's going on. And in that sense, they're quite good at picking up early signs that something is going wrong, and they have the fixation, the focus to be able to learn from it quickly, put it into play, and try to improve things going forward. That's a different response than, for example, a captain or an explorer or a crusader might have. But each of them in their own way, because they're involved in the entrepreneurial process, and failure's the inevitable companion to any entrepreneurial effort, each of them approaches it differently. Captains are probably the best at getting to the reflecting side of a failure, because it's less about somebody being wrong and more about what the team can learn from what just happened. And the fact that they start their leadership agenda with a collaborative impulse, it makes for potentially a more open environment where failure can be discussed earlier, where blame can be distributed perhaps a bit more fairly than might be true in either an explorer or a driver situation. Crusaders around failure, I would argue, are probably the most tolerant of failure, as long as there is continued fidelity towards the mission of the organization. And that gap is what leads to the vision supervision comment that I made earlier. Yeah. They might tolerate failure a little bit longer than their 3 counterparts. And then finally, on explorers are impatient. They want the problem solved. They want the solution scaled. But they have a very analytical systems thinking way of approaching things, so that they take failure as another variable that they need to figure out. And they're fascinated by it. They're not afraid of it. It's just another thing that has to go into the next iteration of their particular solution. So there's no one that does that either ignores it worse or doesn't deal with it better. Each of them approach it in a fundamentally different way.
That's great. Randy, any questions?
Yeah, John, describe for us the role of collaboration in this failure cycle.
So collaboration, entrepreneurship and failure are team sports. It's pretty rare to find examples of failures that matter, that are purely solo activities. And there's no such word as solopreneurship, at least in the formal English language. It's entrepreneurship. Entre is the mantra, as I like to say. It's all about the connections of ideas and resources and people. So failure is very much like that. Collaboration, real collaboration, is about understanding what each other brings to a particular situation, a particular scenario. And managing and leading, I think, is about applying that understanding in trying to improve the ability of the team to perform at a higher level. The failure value cycle, and one of the reasons we're so delighted that so many people around the world are using it now, has become really a tool of collaborative conversation. There is, I was just actually back east earlier this week with a group of Latin American executives, and I shared with them an 11 by 17, almost like a placemat in a restaurant of our failure value cycle. Readers can see that on the website. By the way, on that website, make sure you type in www.theotherfwordbook. Make sure you put book.com, because otherwise you're going to be in a different web. But
good tip.
but I handed out these placemat versions of the failure value cycle, and I asked them to work through it, literally pen and paper in hand, as a way of assessing their team and their organization's failure culture, and having a common framework and to some extent a common vocabulary makes it easier to get this topic of failure out of the closet and onto the table to be discussed. Because Mark Coopersmith and I feel very strongly, based on all of the interviews we've done, based on the classes and the consulting that we've done in this area, fear of failure is, we think, one of the most significant challenges that any leader and executive faces in any organization. It is what keeps innovation constrained. It's what keeps people from trying new ideas, from having the courage to express their own opinions, their own different questions. And it's not that people aren't talented at all. It's not that people aren't dedicated. It's not that people don't want to do better work. But failure carries with it such a stigma. And the memory of failure imprints itself so profoundly on people's future fear of failure that a leader who wants to get the benefit of collaboration, of genuine collaboration, we think has got to be able to deal with this issue of failure openly, honestly, and again with some humility, in order to be able to have a better shot at getting the best out of the people around them.
Well, I can't think of much better advice for any leader, quite frankly. And, we've so enjoyed the conversation today. And I know we've just scratched the surface on so much of your work. But I would like our viewers and listeners to know where they can learn a whole lot more about what you're doing and what your colleagues are doing.
Sure.
So if you could kind of lay that out for us a little bit before we sign off.
Sure. First, in terms of just my activities, I tend to think of myself as somewhat of a juggler. I juggle 4 basic roles. I teach. I have the rare privilege of teaching at 2 of the finest universities in the world. I teach at the business school at UC Berkeley, courses on innovation, entrepreneurship, strategy, leadership, and the like. And I also have the chance as a member of the visiting faculty at Princeton. I teach at Princeton University every fall as well. And then I teach in executive education programs for other universities as well as those around the world. So that's one role. I do a lot of consulting for large organizations internationally, as well as emerging startups in all kinds of different fields. I get a chance to do a certain amount of public speaking at corporate events and industry events and the like around the world. And increasingly, I find time to write, which I'm thrilled with. So books and interviews and those sorts of things. So that's me in a quick nutshell, juggling among those four different roles. My website is www.johndanner.com. The book websites are, again, www.builtforgrowth.com. That's where your viewers and readers can take the exam. They can find out a little bit more about the research that we've done. The website for The Other F Word, which is this book, is www.theotherfwordbook.com. And obviously both books are available on Amazon and any of a number of sources. So you'll get a lot of things for free on either of those two websites. You can find out more about what I do on my website. But I look forward to staying in touch with you folks, and also any of your viewers or readers that may cross paths with me at some point or another.
Well, and I want to make one quick comment just regarding the quiz, because the Build a Personality quiz, I really encourage everyone to take it, and it is very quick. I mean, this is not an exhaustive, examination. It takes just a few minutes. And so if you get a chance, do that and find out whether you are a captain, a crusader, explorer, or driver. Randy?
Very good, John. And you're an accomplished juggler. So we'll put links of all this up in the show notes for the website. We can't thank you enough for being here. To our audience, we appreciate you clicking play and listening to us and hearing these smart folks that we're trying to bring you on What Anyone Can Do podcast. Thanks.
Leo, Randy, thank you much. I appreciate the invitation. So long.
To learn more about our show and what we do, to submit questions to us, and to subscribe to What Anyone Can Do podcast, please visit us at whatanyoneCanDo.com. The podcast is hosted by Leo Batari and me, Randy Cantrell. Our assistant producer is Katie Rutkin. Music provided by Kevin MacLeod is Vibe Ace, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. Thanks for watching or listening. What Anyone Can Do. Please share the podcast. See you next time.